History is not only written by the wars that happened, but also by the ones that never came to be. There is a silence in the desert, not the kind of silence that feels empty, but one that holds its breath, as if the sand, the wind, and even the stars are waiting for something. It was a night like any other, cool, dark, endless, the kind of night that stretches across the Middle East like a blanket of shadow. But deep beneath that sky, in hidden bunkers and secret war rooms, men had made decisions that could have changed the world. Israel had prepared everything. Satellites had traced the underground facilities in Iran. Pilots had rehearsed every maneuver. The targets had been locked in, the calculations done. Some said the mission would last 90 minutes. Others said the consequences would last 90 years. And yet, the strike never came. Somewhere, at some hour, a decision shifted. A hand hovered over a phone and slowly lowered. A whisper passed through the chain of command. Stand down. And just like that, the night returned to silence. But to truly understand that silence, we must step back through years of tension, decades of suspicion, centuries of memory. This is not just the story of one night. It is the story of two civilizations, of belief and betrayal, of shadow and light. It is a story not of war, but of the absence of it, and what might grow in the space where war could have been. A history of tension, unspoken. In the 1960s and 70s, Israel and Iran were not enemies. Strange as it may seem today, they were quiet partners. The Shah of Iran shared intelligence with Israeli agents. Israeli companies worked in Iranian cities. Trade flowed, not loudly, but steadily. It was a time of whispers behind palace doors, a time when enemies were common and mutual benefit made allies of the unlikeliest. But all things shift, and in 1979, the axis tilted. The turning point. A revolution swept through Tehran. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile, draped in black, with crowds chanting beneath his balcony. He did not see Israel as a neighbor or a friend. To him, Israel was an extension of the West, a symbol of oppression, of colonial imposition. The alliance crumbled almost overnight. Embassies closed, flags were burned, and a new era began, one of distrust, rhetoric, and silence filled with noise. A cold war in the warm sands. In the decades that followed, the relationship hardened into something colder than ice. Iran supported Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israel responded with surveillance, with cyber operations, with quiet operations that the world barely noticed. Each watched the other through mirrors. Each waited. When Iran began its nuclear program, perhaps for power, perhaps for more, Israel's quiet watching turned into restless planning. The clock began ticking louder. By the early 2010s, it felt as if the world was holding its breath. Plans within plans. Israeli fighter jets trained at night. Commanders whispered through encrypted lines. They had done this before. Syria, Iraq. They knew the stakes. They knew how fast history could change in a single morning. But then something else happened. A delay, a hesitation, a cooling breath. Perhaps it was diplomacy. Perhaps a message from Washington. Perhaps it was simply the weight of possibility. No strike came. And that brings us back to the night with no news. The headlines never printed. The missiles never fired. The world unknowingly slept through what could have been its darkest dawn. But what if that silence was not weakness, but wisdom? What if peace is not a treaty, but a pause? What if history bends not at the point of explosion, but at the edge where someone chooses not to pull the trigger? In this series, we step gently into this what if, not to rewrite history, but to explore the path not taken. A story told in hush, so that you, the listener, may fall asleep, not just to dreams, but to the possibilities of a world that chose quiet over chaos. The unseen roots. A tree may look strong above the ground, but it is only as steady as the roots hidden beneath the soil. In the stillness of history, there are stories that do not roar. They whisper. They settle like dust and stay there until someone brushes them gently to look beneath. To understand why Israel almost struck Iran, we must not only look at missiles or politics, we must look at something deeper, older, quieter. This is not just about two nations. It is about ideas, fear, memory, and the invisible threads that tie the present to a faraway past. Let us drift now into that past, before they were enemies. Yes, it is true, Iran and Israel were once allies, but even earlier than that, they were not just friends, they were strangers with respect. In ancient times, the Persian Empire allowed the Jewish people to return to their homeland. Cyrus the Great, a name still honored in both cultures, was seen as a liberator, not a conqueror. There was no hatred, no rivalry, only time. But as centuries passed, empires fell, maps changed, and people forgot. In the 20th century, the Shah, wearing suits instead of robes, wanted a country that looked westward, and Israel, small, new, but determined, saw Iran as a rare ally in a region of hostility. There were secret talks, trade agreements, joint plans whispered in the corridors of power. They were not loud friends, but they were partners until the revolution came. 1979. The ground shakes. It was not just a political shift. It was a cultural earthquake. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile, wrapped in religious symbolism, calling for a nation of spiritual purity and independence from foreign influence. To the new Iran, Israel became a symbol, not of a neighbor, but of imperialism, of unwanted presence. The embassy in Tehran was shut down. Photos of Israeli diplomats were torn down. A country that once opened its arms now closed them with iron. The roots had twisted. The soil had changed. Shadows behind the curtain. In the decades that followed, nothing was ever simple, and nothing was ever truly silent. Iran began to fund movements it called resistance. Groups like Hezbollah received money, arms, and ideology. Israel, on the other hand, watched, quietly but carefully. It sent drones, agents, software, not to make noise, but to listen, to predict. The two nations were no longer talking, but they were still connected by fear, by memory, by the cold understanding that each was watching the other. The atom and the sand. In the early 2000s, whispers began again, but this time not of cooperation, but of uranium. Iran claimed it wanted nuclear energy. Others claimed it wanted nuclear weapons. Israel could not take the chance. Not after the Holocaust. Not in a region where enemies surrounded it on every side. And yet, proof was unclear. Intentions were foggy. No smoking gun, just suspicion layered over more suspicion. This is where the unseen roots became tangled. The burden of memory. For Israel, memory is not an academic thing. It is lived. It is passed down in stories, in names etched into walls, in the silence of survivors. To let a potential enemy develop a nuclear weapon, even without clear proof, was, for many leaders, unacceptable. For Iran, the opposite was also true. To give in to Western pressure, to halt its progress, felt like betrayal. Of independence, of strength, of dignity. And so, each year, the distance grew. Not always in action, but in understanding. They no longer spoke the same language. Not Farsi or Hebrew, but the deeper language of trust. By the time the 2010s arrived, it seemed like both countries were standing at the edge of something dark. But there was no explosion, not yet, only movement beneath the surface. Cyber attacks, sanctions, diplomatic posturing, nuclear inspections and denials. It was like watching two tectonic plates press quietly against each other until one day they might slip. And yet, in that tension, there was a strange kind of balance. Not peace, not war, but a space in between, where decisions had not yet been made,
where silence held more meaning than sound. History does not always move in straight lines. Sometimes it circles, waiting for the right moment or the wrong one. In our next chapter, we step into the what if, a world where the strike, the one so carefully prepared, never happened, and the future bent, ever so slightly, toward something else.
The breath of peace. Not all futures begin with fire. Some begin with a breath, quietly exhaled into the night. There are moments in history that are loud, explosions, invasions, declarations. And then there are moments that happen in silence. This chapter is about one such moment, a night where everything was ready for war, and yet no war came. The planes were fueled, the targets marked, the briefings complete, but the strike never launched. It wasn't hesitation, it wasn't fear, it was a pause, a breath. And from that breath, something different began to unfold. The night that passed without fire. Imagine the night sky over the Middle East. It is deep, quiet, brushed with stars that have watched centuries go by. On this night, they see no missiles, no jet engines tearing through the dark, no radar alarms in underground bunkers. Instead, the world sleeps, unaware that it was on the edge. In Tel Aviv, analysts sit in rooms still glowing with blue light, waiting for a signal that never comes. In Tehran, military advisors stay awake longer than usual, feeling something in the air, but unsure what it is. And yet, the sun rises, and nothing has changed. Or perhaps, everything has. Peace through absence. This kind of peace is not signed. There are no handshakes, no photographs, no press conferences. It is an absence, the absence of war, the absence of screaming headlines, the absence of funerals. It is a negative space, like the silence between two musical notes. Some may not even notice it, but it is there, and it matters, because in that silence, possibilities grow. A different kind of reaction. When the world learned, quietly, subtly, that no attack had come, the reactions were mixed. Some celebrated restraint. Some called it weakness. Others simply exhaled and moved on. But beneath the noise, real things began to shift. Backdoor talks restarted. Track 2 diplomacy, the kind where academics and former officials meet in neutral cities, picked up pace. Sanctions were reviewed. Inspections resumed. No breakthroughs, no collapse, just slow, deliberate movement, like the earth softening after winter. The long game. Peace in this version of history is not dramatic. There is no treaty that ends all fear.
There is no magic day when trust returns. But what does happen is time. Time for reflection. Time for politics to cool. Time for other voices, not generals, not firebrands, but teachers, artists, scientists to rise. Iran continues its nuclear energy program, but under stricter observation. Israel remains vigilant, but less reactive. And the world, though skeptical, begins to adapt to this unexpected calm. It's not ideal, it's not easy, but it is different. What didn't happen? Let us imagine what didn't occur. No retaliation from Iran. No Hezbollah missiles in northern Israel. No oil crisis. No global market crash. No sudden flood of refugees. These non-events are invisible, but they are real. They are the blessings of the path not taken. The sounds of the future. In this quiet, alternate future, news anchors speak more softly, markets breathe more evenly, and families, in both Israel and Iran, tuck their children in with less fear. Of course, tension still exists. Mistrust doesn't vanish in a single decision, but neither does it escalate. The silence, once terrifying, becomes familiar, then comforting. It is the sound of a future holding itself steady. The beauty of a pause. We often think of peace as something loud, a parade, a celebration, a grand gesture. But sometimes peace is simply nothing happening. No headlines, no warnings, just an ordinary Tuesday. And in a world that is often so full of fire, perhaps that kind of peace is the most precious. In the next chapter, we'll look deeper into the forces that shape this silence, the choices behind the choice. We'll ask, who stood in the room and said, "Not tonight"? And why did the world listen to them for once?
The men who chose stillness. History often remembers the men who fired the first shot, but forgets those who chose not to. Somewhere in a quiet room, under flickering fluorescent lights, a decision was made. Not with cheers, not with shouts, but with a soft, almost reluctant whisper. No, not tonight. And that one sentence, that pause in the rhythm of history, changed everything that followed. This is the story of the men who chose stillness when the world expected thunder. The weight of the trigger. Every military operation, every bomb, every strike begins long before the launch. It begins in minds, in late-night meetings, war simulations, coffee gone cold on conference tables. It begins with men in suits and uniforms, surrounded by screens and silence. And in the case of Israel's near strike on Iran, those rooms were full. Pilots had trained. Intelligence officers had prepared detailed maps. Generals had run dry rehearsals. Everything was ready, everything but certainty.
The thinkers behind the silence. Let's meet some of the shadows, not by name, but by role. There was the Air Force commander, sharp, confident, carrying decades of pressure. He knew his team could reach the target, but he also knew the mission might not end with the last missile. Then there was the National Security Advisor, cautious, strategic. He spoke less in meetings, but when he did, people listened. He warned of retaliation, of a wider regional war, of global markets trembling. And then the Prime Minister, a man pulled in every direction. History stared over his shoulder, whispering, "Do not allow another threat to grow unchecked." But at the same time, another voice echoed, "Do not light a fire you cannot control." Stillness by design. The choice not to strike wasn't weakness, it was design, deliberate, controlled, uncomfortable. Because doing nothing is harder than doing something. To order a mission to stand down, after months of planning, after pressure from allies and threats from rivals, is not an act of fear, it's an act of restraint. And restraint is heavy. You don't get applause for the war you didn't start. You don't make headlines for the destruction you prevented. But perhaps you give the future a better chance. Whispers from the outside. Of course, this decision wasn't made in a vacuum. Whispers from Washington played a part. Allies quietly urged patience. Diplomats offered last-minute promises, secret inspections, tighter monitoring, private guarantees. And even among Israeli officials there were divisions. Some argued, "Strike now, before it's too late." Others warned, "One attack won't end the program. It will only begin a forever war." And somewhere in that storm of voices, the Prime Minister paused. For a few hours, he walked, he thought, he didn't speak. And when he returned, he gave no grand speech, just a nod. "Stand down." The ripple of the unmade war. That moment rippled quietly outward. Pilots were told to rest. Commanders deleted strike simulations from secure servers. Ambassadors picked up their phones and said nothing, but were quietly relieved. Markets never shook. Tanks never moved. Families in Tel Aviv and Tehran slept peacefully, never knowing how close the night came to fire. And in some quiet part of his mind, perhaps the Prime Minister thought of history, how it would remember him, or not remember him at all. But perhaps that was the point. Stillness is not the absence of power. It is power, held gently. What history forgets? History loves loud heroes, the ones who conquer, the ones who invade, the ones who leave monuments behind. But what about the silent guardians, the ones who held back the flood, the ones who stood at the cliff's edge and turned away? They leave no statues, no street names, but maybe, just maybe, they leave something better, a future untouched. Next, the world that grew in the silence. In our next chapter, we'll journey forward in this imagined timeline to see what happens when the world is given space to breathe, what blooms in the shadow of restraint, what grows in the soil untouched by bombs.
The garden that grew from quiet. When you do not burn the field, you give it time to bloom. In a world so used to thunder, the absence of it feels almost unnatural. And yet, after the strike that never happened, after the jets that never flew, a strange silence settled over the region. Not empty, not numb, but alive, like soil resting after the storm, like breath held, then slowly released. And from that quiet, something unexpected began to grow. Small beginnings. The first changes were barely noticeable. A journalist in Beirut wrote a piece titled, "What Didn't Happen Last Week." It went viral, quietly, without outrage, across forums and coffee shops. In Tehran, university students debated not war, but climate change. One whispered, "It's nice to talk about something that isn't death." The others nodded. In Israel, a teacher brought in a news clipping and told her students, "This is a page that didn't get written in blood. Let's learn from it." The classroom was silent, then curious, then full of questions. No treaties were signed, no parades were held, but minds slowly began to shift. Growth in the background. Governments remained cautious. Spies still spied. Tensions still flickered. But in the spaces between headlines, projects quietly bloomed. An Iranian startup launched a medical AI program, and, surprisingly, its algorithm used open-source Israeli research. No one mentioned it publicly, but developers on both sides noticed and smiled. In Jordan, a nonprofit hosted a regional youth conference. Both Israeli and Iranian students were invited. They didn't shake hands on stage, but they sat next to each other during lunch. And in Cyprus, diplomats from 3 countries met informally, no cameras. They talked about water, drought, solar farms, no fireworks, just seeds. A different kind of memory. Children born in the years after the non-war didn't grow up with sirens. They heard stories, of course, of a night when everything was ready for chaos, but didn't happen. Some believed it, some didn't. But either way, it shaped them. They were not a generation of fighters. They were builders, thinkers, singers. One boy in Haifa grew up to compose a lullaby titled "The Night the Sky Stayed Dark." It was played on the radio in Tehran by accident. No one banned it, no one removed it. People simply listened and let it play. The quiet between crises. Of course, the world did not become perfect. There were still threats, still corruption, still outbreaks of violence here and there. But the great fire never came, because somewhere in the hearts of people, not just leaders, there lived the memory of what almost happened, and the quiet that followed became sacred. A garden, not a battlefield. International observers coined a term, strategic patience. It became the model for others. Not surrender, not appeasement, but stillness as strength, time as diplomacy. It wasn't always successful, but it opened doors that war would have slammed shut forever. And that idea, that gardens could grow where we expect deserts, began to take root in more than just one region. In India and Pakistan, in North and South Korea, in minds that were once closed, now slightly ajar. What you do not destroy may surprise you by what it becomes. A night that gave the world time. Looking back, historians would call this the quiet bloom, a time not defined by action, but by the lack of it, by space, by restraint, by what didn't happen. They would say, it wasn't a peace treaty, it wasn't a miracle, it was simply a pause long enough for hope to catch up. And sometimes that is all the world needs. In our next chapter, we will drift from the human to the cosmic and ask, what does history mean to those who never lived it because they were spared by it? What kind of stories are told by those who live in a world where the war never came? The children of the unwritten war. Some generations are born into the aftermath of war. Others are born into the silence that prevented it. They never saw the jets. They never heard the sirens. They never waited in bunkers. To them, the war was a ghost, one that had almost existed, but never did. These were the children of the unwritten war, born not into peace, but into possibility, born into the calm. The years that followed the near conflict became quietly fertile. Hospitals rebuilt, classrooms expanded, voices, long silenced by fear, began to hum again. And in this world, children were born not with legacies to avenge, but with questions to explore. Why did the war not happen, Mama? And mothers would smile softly and reply, because someone chose not to. Learning what never was. In history books, there were footnotes, sections labeled "The Silence of 2025," lessons taught with a gentler tone, no heroic battles, no grand victories, just decisions, delays, diplomatic hesitations. Children would listen, puzzled at first, then intrigued. You mean they almost destroyed everything and then didn't? Yes, the teacher would say, and that made all the difference. Art from absence. In the art schools of Esfahan and Jerusalem, a movement emerged. The negative canvas, paintings of skies with no fire, sculptures of missiles cracked in half, unused.
Music composed with long, intentional pauses to represent what wasn't played. This was a generation obsessed not with trauma, but with near trauma, with what didn't happen, with what we almost lost. And that made their creations softer, more curious, more grateful.
Games without war. In playgrounds, children no longer played soldier. They played ambassador, water negotiator, border mapper. Their toy kits didn't come with guns. They came with microphones, headphones, notebooks. They built imaginary cities on shared land. They didn't talk about enemies. They talked about future weather. What happens if the river dries? One child would ask. Then we have to call Iran, another would answer. No, a third would giggle, we just build a pipeline together. And the game continued. Teenagers asking better questions. As they grew, these children became teenagers. But they weren't radical. They weren't angry. They were curious. They started online forums like The Thread That Didn't Burn, Unwritten Wars Club, Alt History, The Real One. They questioned everything, not to challenge, but to understand. Why did previous generations always choose fire? Why was silence so rare? Can we make quiet louder? They didn't see restraint as boring. They saw it as brilliant. A global generation. The children of the Unwritten War didn't belong to one country. They belonged to the space between them. They traveled more. They collaborated more. They weren't naive. They understood politics, history, borders, but they saw them as puzzles, not walls. At an international summit for climate youth, an Iranian teen met an Israeli coder. They laughed at how similar their childhoods were. Shared stories of songs, teachers, fears. We were raised in the same shadow, one said. A shadow that never touched us, the other replied. And then they built an app together to track desertification across the region. Not because they had to, but because they could. Peace is not always given. Sometimes it is inherited. Remembering what didn't burn. Each year, on the anniversary of the night that never was, some families light a candle. Not to mourn, not to celebrate, just to remember that silence once protected them. They don't hold speeches. They don't chant. They simply gather, tell stories, look up at the stars, and whisper, "Thank you for the war that wasn't." The power of an unlived history. History is often written in blood, but not always.
Sometimes it is written in inkless pages, in skipped paragraphs, in breaths held and released. And sometimes the most powerful legacy is one that never had to be survived. In our next and final chapter, we will drift gently into reflection. How does the world remember a silence that changed it? How do we honor the choice to do nothing?
The echo of no. Some echoes do not come from sound, but from silence, so full it hums forever. History rarely remembers the things that didn't happen. There are no statues for wars avoided, no museums for bridges never burned, no anthems for moments of restraint. And yet, in the quiet corners of the world, something lingered, an invisible echo of a choice once made, not to attack, not to retaliate, not to escalate, just to wait, just to say no. Saying no and letting go. It wasn't a loud no. There were no speeches, no public declarations. It was the kind of no that happens behind closed doors, in the early hours of the morning, between a heartbeat and a command, a decision made by tired men and weary women who had seen too much fire to mistake it for light. And in saying no, they set something rare into motion, an echo not of destruction, but of restraint. Ripples, not headlines. The world kept moving. News outlets moved on. Markets adjusted. Talk shows found new things to debate. But the echo, it did not need a spotlight. It moved quietly, like wind across water, like seeds scattered by hands long gone. A single choice not to act became 1,000 unseen consequences. A father lived to walk his daughter down the aisle. A bridge once targeted became a trade route. A scientist stayed and discovered a breakthrough. A lullaby was written and remembered. These weren't miracles, just moments, made possible by not doing what seemed inevitable. The sound of what we didn't lose. In libraries and in lullabies, the story lived on, not in textbooks, but in feelings, in pauses. Children would ask, what did they say no to? And the answer was simple and enormous, to everything that would have ended us, and nothing that helped us grow. That no was not weakness, it was clarity. It was a mirror turned inward, asking, what are we about to become, and is that who we want to be? The history that chose us. Some historians later debated, did it really matter? Would the strike have changed everything? And maybe the answer was yes, but only because it didn't happen. The very notness of it gave the world room to breathe, room to rethink. And in that space, people didn't just survive. They remembered how to imagine. They chose smaller conflicts, slower speeches, longer silences, because they had felt the weight of a no that shaped a generation. Memory without monuments. There was never a memorial built, No stone engraved with names of the saved. No torch lit for peace uncelebrated. Instead, remembrance happened in subtler ways. A grandfather who always paused before speaking. A mother who told bedtime stories about leaders who listened. A school that added restraint to its curriculum. And in those silences, echoes, not of pain, but of possibilities preserved. Echoes that never fade. In the end, the echo was not about the war. It was about the space the war would have taken, the future it would have devoured, the voices it would have drowned. And because it never came, those spaces were filled by laughter, by learning, by late-night walks under skies that remained untouched. The echo didn't fade. It folded into everyday life, into habits, into caution, into care. You do not always need a hero. You sometimes just need someone who stops the story before the fire begins. Final thoughts before sleep. Now, as you lie here, quiet, breathing, drifting, think of that night when someone whispered no. Think of all the worlds that silence allowed. And know this, even the gentlest choices can echo forever. You have reached the end of our story, or perhaps the beginning of a new one. Thank you for walking through this gentle history. Sleep well, and remember the power of quiet things.